Hi, Zachary.
Hello, Robert.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm good. I should introduce you to our viewing audience. I'm Robert
That
Wright.
might be good.
Yeah, because you've never been here, you know?
No?
You're everywhere else, though. You're a veritable media juggernaut, which is funny because, you know, when I first came across your name, it was as author of the book Peace Be Upon You, which was about the prospects for coexistence among Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And then before I know it, so I'm thinking, oh, this guy who writes about Islam and stuff, you know? But before I know it, you know, you're all over, you're like writing this book, Superfusion, and that was like a year ago, and you've got another one out already, and you're always like on CNBC and like talking about financial markets, and now you've got this column in Time magazine where they show a picture of half of your face.
I know we could try to do that with the blogging head thing, right?
Yeah, so that your Time readers would recognize you. Maybe we should cut off half of your face.
Yeah, and we can try that for the next one, or I can move.
Could you move a little?
I can move. Like,
could you move over?
So like that. There we go.
So that your
you
Time
can't see me,
readers will...
but this will be my
by
Time
the
magazine.
way, you've been doing this Time column for a few months, I think. If you, like, after a year or something, do you get a promotion and they show your whole face?
I've been asking that, but it's a corporate thing. So.
Well, pixels cost money, you know. And it's and there's a lot of financial pressure on old media now.
Right. No, I mean they've got to make money, particularly with Newsweek now fusing with the Daily Beast.
That's right. That's hot off the press. That's news.
That's news today.
That's
Newsweek and the Daily Beast.
So it's like you and Tina Brown duking it out at this point, basically.
Well, I wrote
Karabell.
a column for the Daily Beast yesterday, so I guess it's not.
Oh,
quite
you
like
write
that.
for the Daily Beast.
I have written for the Daily Beast.
Oh,
yes.
little conflict of interest, Zachary, that you'd like to talk about?
Maybe, but I'm an independent actor, so for now, there's no internal conflict of interest.
I think. You know, but maybe the reason they show half of Zachary in Time magazine is because the other half is working for the competition, do you think?
that could be.
They each show half of your face?
That could be.
Well, anyway, you know probably more than I do about a lot of stuff that's been in the news lately. There's been a lot of international finance stuff in the news. We're taping this on Friday. And the headlines have come in saying that this G20 summit in Seoul was not especially productive. That's kind of the standard view. Although I noticed the administration is pushing a revisionist view that showed up online in the New York Times only moments ago. But is it your understanding that not a lot happened?
Well, actually, the column for the Daily Beast yesterday was about the upcoming G20 summit, which is now, I suppose, the up and has come G20
It's the Came Summit.
But I mean, first of all, I think it's true that not a lot happened. There were some perfectly agreeable, and I'm sure no one could disagree, statements about poverty alleviation, working together to make sure there's a more stable system, blah, 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 blah. But I would say that, in my view at least, a summit that avoids bad joint policy is a much better outcome than a summit that endorses bad joint policy.
What would the bad joint policy have been that you feared?
So you had Secretary Geithner from the United States, and therefore Obama, signing on to a notion that countries around the world should establish a quota for how much their national economies can or cannot be in surplus or in deficit relatively.
Right.
And I think the number thrown out a few weeks ago was 4%. So you can't have more than 4% current account deficit. You can't have more than 4% current account surplus, as a notion of anything greater than that, and things get out of whack.
And is it the case? Can I interject this question? Is it the case that we had defined the range in a way that our deficit was within it, and so we didn't have any work to do, but some surpluses were not inside it, and so other countries were going to have to do work? Is that?
No, I don't think that's it, because if we keep on our current path, our negative will surpass 4%.
We would have surpassed.
So
okay.
It would have put some onus on the U.S., at least in terms of guidelines for policy. But I think the problem is that the notion that these things can be, at least in terms of a global economic system, established by national economic quotas is a mistake. It assumes that basically, what are there, 190 countries in the world? I mean, you have to count smaller countries, of course, like Lesotho, but even so, the idea that a national economy has to be perfectly in balance in order for the global economic system to be in balance is, I think, a notion that should be debated. It's hard to argue one way or the other because we haven't really lived in the system long enough to go back and say, well, at X, Y, and Z moments in the past, here's what worked, and therefore here's what we have every expectation of working in the future. But I think there's a real problem of seeing the world as composed of these kind of national entities, each of which have to be perfectly stable and in balance for the whole system to be in balance. It would be like saying that every single state in the United States has to have exactly the same amount of goods flowing in as flow out, and the same amount of capital flow in, flow out, in order for the United States as a whole to be economically viable.
Okay. Let me give you a little pushback, but first I want to clarify, those surplus deficit numbers they're talking about are numbers that reflect trade imbalances, basically, right?
They were also talking about current account imbalances, which reflect capital imbalances as well as
okay,
trade
but
imbalances.
I mean, we're not talking about the government deficit as the Tea Partiers talk about it, which is...
No, but they were also talking about that as, there should also be limitations on deficit to GDP as a way of getting at a greater global stability as well.
Yeah, but the 4% numbers reflect the international balances.
Yes.
Now, so you're kind of saying that the nation state is an archaic unit of analysis, but it is true that if China did what we want them to do, which is let their currency appreciate, so that one of their yuans or whatever could buy more dollars, then that would have real effects. That would increase the Chinese demand for American products, reduce American imports of Chinese goods. That would be a real. That's not.
Well,
I'm not saying we have the right to demand it, but it's not nothing, right?
I'd push back on you in the second point. It would definitely increase the purchasing power of Chinese consumers. It would not necessarily reduce the amount of imports the United States draws from China, because one, even 10-15% increases in the cost of Chinese goods doesn't necessarily make any other country's goods more competitive than Chinese, and it absolutely doesn't make us more competitive in the kinds of lower-end manufacturing goods that we import from China. So it does make the Chinese consumer have more purchasing power and therefore be able to buy more stuff from either other countries or from their own companies.
I mean, certainly, if you cranked it up dramatically, which you wouldn't, but if you doubled the value of the Chinese currency, that would have a dramatic effect on like American workers, right?
I'm not so sure it would have any effect on American workers. So in 1970, the overall output of U.S. manufacturing in $2005, so we're going to do this in an apples-to-apples way without accounting for inflation over the past 4 years. In 1970, the aggregate output of U.S. manufacturing was $1.5 trillion. What do you think it was, Bob, in the middle of 2009, at the worst of the Depression, aggregate output of U.S. manufacturing?
The worst of the recession?
Yeah.
I guess more than that if it's a trick question?
Well, yeah, but how much more?
I don't know, man.
So it was $3 trillion.
It's a lot more.
In 2005 dollars. So manufacturing as a percentage of output of GDP in the United States from 1970 to today
has been
an almost constant 70. Has been an almost constant 16%.
Right.
So you can't say that the emergence of China in the past 8 or 9 years has hollowed out U.S. manufacturing when U.S. manufacturing output has doubled from 1970 to now and has remained a constant percentage of U.S. GDP for the past 40 years. What has been hollowed out is the amount of jobs that are required to produce that output.
Right.
We do much more efficient, higher-end production.
Right.
And we do much less efficient, labor-intensive production of lower-cost goods.
Right.
Now, why would we, A, want to start doing much more production of lower-end, lower-wage-paying goods?
Well, if you were a relatively uneducated worker, you'd wish that we were doing more than that, right?
But even a relatively uneducated worker in the United States has a reasonable expectation of a much higher salary than a relatively uneducated worker in China.
Not at the moment. They don't even have a very good expectation of a job.
No, but the amount of money that a job would matter for them as opposed to unemployment is not the amount of money that any American job is feasibly going to pay. I mean, we're not going to pay our workers $1.50 an hour.
True.
And $1.50 an hour is much more than a lot of workers earn in China for equivalent work.
True.
So even if you doubled the amount you were paying Chinese labor, and over the next 10 years, China will double the amount they're paying those laborers. They may triple it, they may quadruple it.
Yeah.
it doesn't then mean the United States is suddenly going to either be able or willing, for that matter, or that it would be good policy for us to then make those same things. A lot of what has happened in U.S. manufacturing is a product of, yes, globalization, and yes, productivity generated by technology.
Right.
And it's a lot easier to rail at China than it is for us to argue and say, damn you, computer.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so you're making that argument that a lot of what unemployment dislocation we've seen has to do with technology and not with Chinese laborers out competing our workers. So what would your... Well, let me return to the China question. I guess the point my view is, certainly it would have some effect if you changed... I think almost everyone says it would have some effect if you changed the relative currency values.
Right.
My question about our demanding that China change those currency values has always been kind of, what right do we have to demand that? I mean, and that's becoming an especially valid question now that we ourselves, within the last week or so, our Fed has embarked on a policy that looks to some people as one that is designed to depreciate our own currency relative to other currencies, which is exactly what we're complaining that the Chinese do.
Yeah, so one thing you had at this recent summit was countries like Germany, and even the British Prime Minister said something to this effect, as well as China, accusing the United States, and in this case the Federal Reserve, of purposely devaluing the U.S. currency in order to enhance U.S. exports and have a kind of beggar-thy-neighbor approach. Now, it's certainly true that a lower value of the dollar should help our exports. It's equally true that, at least in public, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Secretary and the U.S. government says that this policy has nothing to do with lowering the value of the U.S. dollar and everything simply to do with keeping enough liquidity in the financial and economic system to make sure that this pretty tepid recovery doesn't stall. But the point is that a lot of this is eye of the beholder, right? Let's step back for a minute. In terms of directionality, there isn't actually such huge difference between what we've been advocating the Chinese to do and what the Chinese have been intending to do domestically. Meaning China has been under a slow, gradual policy of allowing their currency to rise in value. And the Chinese currency went up 22%, 21% between the middle of 2005 and the middle of 2008. And then that policy was halted during the financial crisis. And that policy of gradual appreciation was reintroduced in June of this year, and the currency's gone up to 2.5% since then. Because the Chinese want to have more purchasing power. They want to have a domestic economy that's more self-sustaining. That's very much in their national self-interest, right? The argument is over speed, pace, and reason. And it's not, whether we have a right to or not. I mean, I think you can fairly claim nations will demand of other countries whatever they feel they can get away with.
Sure, but we have long talked as if we have the right. I mean, we've long said things like, right now we have a strong dollar policy, which usually we have had. Now, in truth, we probably didn't have all that much control over what the value of the dollar was, and it was usually a bluff. But we acted as if a nation has the right to declare what direction it wants its currency to move in and do what it can to influence that, right?
Right, and I would argue, back to the point about the nation state, that let's say before the 1970s, or maybe at some point in the latter part of the 20th century, the ability of the nation state to unilaterally determine the warp and woof of its own domestic economy lessened dramatically, and has been lessening every year since. Yeah. It's not that the nation state doesn't matter, it matters greatly. It's that it matters in a context of a global system which is shaped by companies and capital flows and different units and different agglomerations of capital and trade that constrain the ability of any government to unilaterally determine its own economic fate and its own economic outcome. And frankly, as the dominant economy of the past 50 or 60 years, it makes sense that the United States would sort of be the last bastion of accepting that reality. Although, to be fair, the Chinese are equally unwilling to accept that reality, even though they are daily confronted with it and having to adjust their role within it.
Yeah. Now, one place some people would take what you're saying is, if policy making at the national level has less and less influence, then the thing to do is make policy collectively, at the global level, or at least the international level, maybe the regional level. But that is kind of the idea behind the G20, is that more and more. This was a G20 summit, of course, the 20 most powerful kind of economies More and more, any individual nation is really powerless to influence much by itself. I mean, for example, a stimulus policy, if you do a lot of government spending, a lot of, or tax cuts, either way, the resulting spending, a lot of that leaks beyond your borders, overseas, and so on. So the argument is, well, if countries don't have that much control over their own fates, but we do want to have coherent policy making in the world, we should do it collectively at the joint level, have some global governance, something like the G20. Do you buy that argument in principle, that there's something the G20 should be getting together and actually deciding to do?
Oh, I totally buy the argument in principle and in theory. Part of the problem is, particularly for the United States, is we are in a global context much more used to dictating policy than we are to having policy be shaped with us as a prominent but by no means sole force in setting that policy. Mm-hmm. And our attitude has been, and again, an inevitable outcome of power, influence, etc., has been if policies are decided upon that we don't like and we don't agree with, we're not going to endorse them and we're not going to do them, which is kind of the antithesis of actual joint policy. Joint policy means you get together, you debate, you argue, and then you agree, and you accept that there are things in that agreement that you're not going to like and you're not going to want to do, and you do them anyway because you feel like your self-interest is more suited by making those compromises, right, than it is by saying it's either my way or no way.
And you do horse trading. I mean, you say, we want this, and the other guy says, we want this, and you say, okay, we'll do both of them. We'll do this and you'll do that. I mean, it's not like you go along with whatever other people want in a collective body, but you each kind of get something, right?
Exactly. And, maybe in the greater scheme of things, these meetings of the G20 progressively will be seen in retrospect as just kind of the necessary stages of a process of negotiation that leads to some collective decision about how nations can best contribute to global economic growth in a sustainable fashion that mitigates against risks, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we may turn around in 5 years and go, oh yeah, there were these disagreements and people walked away from the table and then they came back to the table and worked it out. And that would, I guess, would be the optimistic spin on some of the current issues. Mm-hmm. But even so, that would demand that both the United States and, yes, China and, yes, Germany and England and Argentina, whoever else is part of this mix, agree on measures, some of which they are likely to disagree about. All I'm saying is I think it's largely true that a lot of other countries are more used to listening to the United States tell them what to do than they are used to the United States compromising about what to do.
Right, and they're kind of
all things being equal.
And they're kind of getting sick of letting the United States do whatever it wants, especially in light of our effectively declining power, relative power. And meanwhile, we're not yet used to the idea of not telling everybody what to do, although I think we're starting to get used to it.
Right, so Obama in the United States in this recent week or so is sort of on the short end of that historical stick, right? So even going there and speaking moderately and conciliatorily, we still have a position, we still have an agenda. We're not, Obama may have a better style and a more friendly demeanor as far as the international community is concerned, but he's still the representative of a country that has a perspective, an approach, and a policy, and they're taking advantage of this. This is the classic kick them while they're down, and it's, we shouldn't be aghast that this is what's going on, right? This is just reality, and there are a lot of people who are, frankly, tired of being lectured to, and are taking the advantage of doing some of the lecturing.
Yes, and more we will probably have to listen to them. It is kind of odd, the little reversal that happened this time, because, well, there's two reversals. First of all, when these countries met amid the height of the economic crisis, amid that kind of pressure, they actually did emerge with more in the way of a coherent agreement. At that point, the idea was they all needed to stimulate and do it collectively, and so there was some agreement on that. This time, there's less agreement in that regard. The other little reversal, the funny reversal that's happened is, like, as of a month ago, Europe was, as I understand it, on our side in complaining that the Chinese were holding their currency, artificially, keeping it artificially low in value. And then when our Fed did this thing a week ago of printing $600 billion or something, or deciding to buy American bonds, and in effect probably reduce the value of our currency, all of a sudden the Europeans shifted sides and joined the Chinese in complaining about us doing that, right? Is that kind of what happened?
And I think, again, I guess political scientists would say you have to expect a good bit of balancing against whoever seems to be, at any given moment, the biggest threat or problem, right? So, Europe is kind of the swing vote between China and the United States in that dynamic. And may well play off each side, and not that Europe is even, as we know, speaking with one voice. I mean, there's no agreement in Europe between Germany, England, France, Italy, Greece about exactly how to manage economies. Mm-hmm. In fact, as we know, there's great disagreement about it. But even so, you're going to get some of this balancing against each other, playing one off against each other, because even though it may be true that the relative power of the United States is shifting as other countries in other parts of the world increase in prosperity, mm-hmm. The United States is still the largest economy in the world and is still central to global finance. I mean, the European Union is technically, if you add up all of its 27 economies, is a bigger economic bloc, but the United States remains the largest mm-hmm. unitary economic nation in the world, mm-hmm. regardless of China. And it will be richer per capita than the Chinese will be until we're all long and dead.
Wait, who will be richer than who, you said?
The United States will be richer per capita.
Per capita.
Than China,
But not in the aggregate, possibly.
Not in the aggregate, but does the aggregate really matter, right? I mean...
Well, in terms of the overall economic power of the nation, in terms of the weight it can throw around, aggregate power does matter.
Yeah, but again, back to that question of how much aggregate power can a nation actually throw around. I mean, the Chinese have a lot of growth and a lot of dynamism, but what we don't recognize is that because China has pegged its economic future to the dollar, mm-hmm. how the United States does deeply impacts how China does. I mean, they're looking for their own exit strategy.
Well, that's the other thing people don't realize, and tell me if I've got the math wrong or something, but one thing about when China holds so many U.S.-denominated bonds, so many of our bonds, that if they were to radically appreciate their currency, or if they were to watch us radically depreciate ours, they would be seeing those assets radically decline in actual value, right?
Exactly.
So,
and they are...
So it's a little bit much to ask that when they buy all this debt that we generate because we don't have our fiscal house in order, it's a little much to ask them to do these things, like appreciate their currency. I mean, not that wouldn't be good in a way, but for us to ask them to appreciate it rapidly in a way that sees these assets we dumped on them decline in value, I don't know. I don't blame them, is what I'm saying.
Right, and again, it's partly a question of speed, because they want their currency to appreciate, right? They don't want to be as tethered to the United States. I mean, I happen to believe that governments have a fetish for sovereignty. That's just understandable mm-hmm. and normal, mm-hmm. but that their actual economic sovereignty in the world we're living in has been decreasing, even though there was a period of time in the fall of 2008 when just the pure financial system was in deep crisis. That's a moment of where government becomes utterly essential. Mm-hmm. The problem is now government and publics around the world haven't moved beyond that crisis moment, whereby government may think that it is absolutely essential, and it certainly has a call on resources. But is it really the one calling the shots globally, right? Interest rates are low, not because central banks have made interest rates low. Interest rates are low because there's just a lot of money sloshing around the world, and there's not a lot of cost of capital. Mm-hmm. If you've got a lot of money and not a huge demand for it, there's no reason for interest rates to be that high, right? Mm-hmm. But governments think that it's all about getting their monetary policy right.
Right.
And maybe not. It's just, I think that a lot more is going on than what the G20 brings to the table. It'd probably be a lot better if the G20, if there was some sort of collaboration between G20 financial institutions and global businesses about what the shape of the system would be. And we are so far away from that I know that that's a pie in the sky suggestion. But
what kind of concrete thing do you even have in mind? What kind of thing would they collaborate on?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe you get, the heads of 500 of the largest companies in the world, or do some representation of them along with private banks and some sort of, I guess representation of labor. But the point being, all these are shaping the global system pretty intimately, irrespective of what governments are or are not doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would personally hope that the G20 could evolve into something more systematic in the way it works. But yeah, that may be pie in the sky.
And it might be. I mean, again, we could be looking back at this in a few years and see these moments as steps along the way, right? As opposed to, oh, that's it. Everyone went home and is going to play with their own toys now.
No, I think I think either we will or we'll see trouble. I mean, I think global governance needs to evolve, and if it doesn't, we may be in trouble. And it does evolve incrementally, and even something like the World Trade Organization. 30 years ago, there was GATT that had no adjudicatory power whatsoever, and the WTO has a little. That's a step. And it's more or less respected, the adjudicatory, and it's a weak kind of adjudicatory power, but it does authorize nations to levy punitive sanctions when a judgment is made that they've been so on. Anyway, so you worry a lot about this China bashing.
I worry about China bashing as a smokescreen for America to deal with its own issues.
Right.
I think it's a waste of time, period. And I think it's a way of distracting from attention that needs to be put to our own domestic economic issues. Basically, we should start from the presumption of China's going to do what China's going to do, and our tools of coercion that are not also deeply harmful to our own domestic economy are limited. So we do have tools of coercion. We could slap a 30% tariff on their goods. We could do all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But not without, I think, creating deep and profound and immediate dislocations to our own economy that would have far worse effects on us than they would on China in the short term, and bad effects on both of us.
Yeah, in fact, the idea of that WTO adjudicatory mechanism I'm talking about is to keep nations from doing that kind of self-destructive thing that, we can take our grievances to the WTO if we have them, and that's the way it's supposed to work.
Right. So, again, it's not that we're without tools. It's that those tools essentially boomerang negatively on us.
When the
and I don't think we quite get that. I feel like the nature of the debate assumes that we've just about had it. Our patience is wearing thin. We've been very tolerant. We've been very patient as China has eroded X, Y, and Z of our domestic economy, and now we need to stand up to them as part of reinventing ourselves.
Well, one reason for that is I think people tend to jump from one realm to another. You've been talking about the purely economic realm, basically, but then China does something like exploit its near monopoly or its dominance of the rare earth minerals market to coerce Japan regarding a territorial dispute, and even to fire a shot across our bow. For a while, apparently, they were within the last few weeks they were restricting the export of rare earth minerals to us and to Europe, as I understand it. Now, that's not an economic realm, but that's definitely the kind of thing that puts Americans in a mood to lay down the law to China, right? And not without some reason. I mean, that's a little scary,
Well, I mean, I suppose it would be a different kind of discussion if China were vastly wealthy in natural resources that were not replaceable elsewhere in the world on which we depended.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this would be a different discussion.
Well, it's true that
but other than rare earths, which China has, but like a lot of the rest of the world has in abundance, we just haven't developed them.
Right, and it would take us a couple of years to get up to speed, I think. And one reason we don't develop them is because of the environmental costs. For one thing, China is willing to absorb that.
Right. So I mean, rare earths is a bit of a misnomer in that they're not so rare and they're not earth. But they were basically doing what I would expect any country to do, which is, as you said, send a warning shot across the bow of, hey, by the way, don't push us around because we can give as good as we get, right? And look, for 3 weeks of it being that way is much more threatening to Japan than it was to the United States.
Yeah, but why were they doing it to us in Europe? We weren't in a territorial dispute with them.
It probably because it's very difficult to target one country in a global supply chain system. So, it's pretty hard to cut off shipments to one place when a lot of this stuff gets distributed by other shipping companies that aren't Chinese. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's hard to just target one country.
Yeah, but I also think it's just stupid politics on their part. When you do have, in the near term, a kind of control, a dominance, control of a mineral, it's true that these things exist in North America, but it would take us a while to ramp up and produce them. In the near term, China has kind of a stranglehold on some of these, and for it to kind of start holding the world hostage, I personally think is such bad PR that
I agree, but it's what Russia tried to do with natural gas to Eastern Europe and the Ukraine, I guess about a year ago, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, talk about threatening. There's a lot of Central and Eastern Europe that depends almost entirely on gas supplies for heating from Russia.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's a spigot. You turn it off and really bad things happen really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of tried to remind everybody that, hey, don't mess with us too much because we can shut off your heat and your power. And that backfired because when you threaten people that much, they will start taking major action to make sure they can't be threatened.
Right. And they will join together.
Right.
So do you have... So in this purely economic realm, your view is, look, let's get our own house in order. Not much you can do about China anyway. We're exaggerating the extent to which our problems originate with China and so on. Do you have views on so in that sense, on the economic front, you're saying just don't think of China as a threat, you know?
Right. And if anything, I think in many ways China has been a stabilizer to an otherwise pretty critical U.S. economy over the past years, as opposed to an underminer.
Well, it's bought this debt that somebody had to buy from our point of view because we keep generating it.
And it's reinvested that debt in the United States in a way that at least during 2008, 2009 was probably safer than if we had invested it in our own financial system, which was imploding.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
It's like an offshore bank in that sense. I mean, they were like our offshore bank. Somewhat immune from the tectonic waves that were flowing over our own banking system. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I mean, we were worried about Mexico jobs in 1992. Remember Ross Perot with the giant suck and sound that was going to lead all the jobs to go south of the border? Mm-hmm. I mean, if any country's really been hurt by the rise of China, it's Mexico.
Yeah, because their workers are in more direct competition.
Exactly. But, we do have significant domestic economic issues and dislocations, which, in a funny respect, the housing bubble, let's say 2004, 2007, as well as a little bit of the internet bubble in the 1990s, kind of masked. Meaning there were a lot of people, and this is now starting to be the past, right? In the 1990s, when the media, at least, were aflush with stories of visionary technology changing the world and making a frictionless future where everybody would be rich and happy, there was a lot of America going, hello, I'm not seeing this. Mm-hmm. I'm not feeling it. I don't have a stock portfolio that's going up 100% because I was in on the ground floor for the Yahoo IPO. And there were a lot of people who were losing their jobs because manufacturing's been losing jobs every month or almost every month for the past 40 years, who weren't feeling the flush effects of the housing boom either. And we've had a slow leveling off of our growth with a growth market in our expectations. Mm-hmm. And that's been going on for 20 or 30 years. People talk about it in terms of the hollowing out of the middle class or wage stagnation. But the reality is, for the most part, the U.S. economy for the past 20 to 30 years, but at least the past 20, has not created growth on aggregate relative to expectations.
Well, do you see any hope on that front? I mean, if you were one of these workers who has been dislocated by the forces you describe, technologically driven productivity increases and blah, 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 and
global
some competition from foreign workers, to be sure,
right.
What are the prospects for them?
Well, I think the short-term prospects are grim, which is why you could make the argument for one of the reasons governments and societies create social safety nets is, if the reality is that the prospects are grim, you cannot societally throw a portion of your community, if the nation's a community, to the dogs because things have gotten dislocated, particularly if you have the means to prevent that. It's also can be socially hugely destabilizing. Mm-hmm. And the Tea Party, even if it was represented by, oddly enough, mostly white middle-class workers with jobs, right? still is a manifestation of that beginnings of anger and confusion about these dislocations that are not being adequately addressed.
Yeah, but the irony is that the prescription supposedly coming from the Tea Party, which is, balance your budget as soon as possible, leaves you little room to expand the safety net.
Right. Well, but the prescriptions coming from the Populist Party in the heartland in the 1880s and 1890s for tighter monetary policy, right? Because they were worried that all the price of their grain would be deflated by Eastern bankers, also wasn't in their economic self-interest. But that feeling of something has to be done and something has to be stopped is what's the wellspring behind it. Even if the policies are not likely designed to achieve those outcomes, that's where those feelings are coming from, and that's where that movement is coming from. And the degree to which we are, look, I probably sound as cliche as the next person about my feelings of sclerosis in Washington, the inability of a system to respond with urgency to issues that are urgent.
Yeah.
And I'm of two minds of that, right? I'm of the mind of a citizen who's living in real time as part of a community and a nation, where I care deeply about what's going on and want to find ways to move the needle productively. Otherwise, I wouldn't speak and write and do, manage money and do the things that I'm trying to do. But I'm also of another mind, which is a little more of the historian of, it's a really, really tough road for a very powerful and rich society reaching a level of economic maturity and relative power stasis to make meaningful changes with urgency, absent some sort of catastrophic crisis.
It is. But, speaking of China, one thing I got into trouble with my daughter for recently, we actually went to China and this summer, for the first time I've been there, and after a few days there talking to people there, I actually came to the conclusion that the Chinese government, clearly not a democratic government, is actually arguably better at responding effectively to the expressed needs of its people lately than we are. And the reason is the Communist Party is so insecure about its status that if you get 500 people in a city, complaining about some environmental issue or something, it gets their attention and they have the power to act. Now, I'm not endorsing their system of government, but it is the fact that our representatives, in contrast, do nothing but posture and run off their mouths and don't get a damn piece of coherent legislation, passed. I mean...
And it seems to be very difficult for ideas to be translated into action, right? And part of that's just the nature of a Washington system where everybody can essentially say no to everybody else's yeses much more easily than anyone can say yes and do something.
Right.
So it's not just bureaucracy. I mean, look, India is terrible on a lot of these things as well, and yet because of its particular moment in time or catching a historical wave or because the trajectory is towards more efficiencies and not less and towards less bureaucratic problems and not more, they're beginning to move, right? I mean, again, India's democracy, both regionally and nationally, and their bureaucracy, in many respects makes us look like the paragons of efficiency.
Yeah, now speaking of India, another place Obama has been recently, of course, is India, and he did a big love-in with India. He said they belong they deserve a permanent seat on the Security Council, and so on. Now, part of this was apparently motivated by a perceived need to balance China. Now, of course, this balance doesn't refer so much to the economic realm, at least not, well, to some extent at least. Their concern is about the military, non-economic means of coercion or leverage that China might use, and they think we need to have some kind of de facto alliance with India to balance that. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I mean, I think what you said is certainly correct as motivation and rationale for what was done, and is not bad policy in that respect. I mean, irrespective of what I've just said about China, reminding China, I guess, not to get too big in its own britches, even though who are we to say that, but reminding them of that structural reality is certainly not a bad thing occasionally, right? Because they've got to live in this world too. And, so it makes sense for India and the United States, which haven't exactly had a legacy of warm and fuzzy relationships. It's gotten better in the past 5 or 6 years to have this détente.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, the point about domestic American society is also one of, it's not just our inefficiencies, right? It's this inability to move forward. And I mean, my view on this has a lot to do with the cultural moment that I don't think is easily amenable to any particular solution. I see it more in terms of how does a nation that's used to a lot of growth and a lot of increase in power and prosperity deal with that potentially slowing down.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people say, oh, no, this is what people said in the 1970s about America, and that Americans have always torn out their hair and moaned their fate when things were bad and assumed that the party is finally over, and that leads to a sense of introspection and reinvention that generates that next moment of innovation and cultural and economic efflorescence.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe, right? Maybe we'll all look back at this and watch this discussion 10 years from now, and I'll go, wow, I still had hair to tear out, and look how questioning I was of the inherent strengths of this incredible society that was just at a low point about to regenerate. And I'm not ruling that out. But I do think that the context is different. We live in a world of ascending middle class outside of our borders, and that's going to shape how we do what we do, and it has to shape how we do what we do.
Well, I would go further, as we almost have to hope for a decline in our relative power, in the sense that if China does not keep, it seems that we have to want China to, as it embraces markets, as it embraces our economic philosophy, which in my mind actually does tend to bring some political loosening up with it, and in my view already has, okay? If we don't want China to succeed in moving toward at least an American model, what is the alternative? What do we want? I don't think it's in our interest for China to fail spectacularly. And if they succeed in harnessing the potential they have, we are going to see a relative power decline. I'm sorry.
Right. And the same thing of India and Brazil, and then who knows about Indonesia, it's nice to see Indonesia briefly on the international radar screen. It's got 210 million people and has 200 million Muslims. It's not an Arab Muslim nation. They have very different ways of understanding and conceiving of Islam. You've certainly written about this, Bob, and it's it's a different kind of beast, and they too are starting to see some real growth. Talk about a difficult place to govern. It's 3,000 miles of islands, but they have a lot of natural resources, and they've seen their economy grow partly because they're selling raw materials to China,
right?
Which is partly why Brazil is doing well as well. But, I agree that we want the rest of the world to prosper, i.e. it is in our self-interest for everyone to do well, particularly given that, we don't quite know what the limits are of growth in a mature society, but we certainly know that there's immense potential left in the world outside the United States that our capital and companies, and to some degree, therefore, our individuals, can tether themselves to very beneficially. That doesn't necessarily do anything for the unemployed auto worker in greater Detroit. But it does something for us structurally.
Right, and so you're saying, as for the development of these nations that are moving toward our values, certainly embracing our economic philosophy, don't bemoan it, certainly don't try to fight it with protectionism, and to the extent that we face our own economic problems at home, you're saying deal with those at the level of national policy in terms of safety nets and stuff. And I gather that in that regard, you are not a deficit hawk, right? As I infer.
I am an adamant non-deficit hawk.
Right. So.
And look, the United States in that respect, I think, shouldn't be listening to what David Cameron and the British are saying, or to what the Germans are saying, because it's an apples and oranges comparison. If the United States were an economy like Great Britain that was both a mature economy, but also one that was highly dependent on funding from external sources in currency not its own, then real deficit hawk approaches would be necessary, because you would have the legitimate fear that capital would be cut off if you needed it. But because the dollar is, for now, the only viable global currency, whether it should or shouldn't be, we have an ability to continue to spend, foolishly or wisely, well beyond what almost any country in the world has, simply because of the dollar.
Right.
Now, I think what we're doing is taking advantage of that. I don't mean consciously taking advantage of that. I mean, we are using that exceptional place and using it badly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're using that ability to run deficits and have very low cost of capital because everybody has to kind of be invested in the dollar to spend really unwisely.
So what's an example of that, and how would you spend instead?
So the analogy would be it's like we're getting a $10,000 loan and we're all going to Vegas, as opposed to we're getting a $10,000 loan and we're thinking about education, we're retrofitting our homes,
Mm-hmm.
we're building good infrastructure and roads. I mean, China really shows just how much efficient physical infrastructure matters, and India really shows just what a limitation inefficient physical infrastructure is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have it. It's like it's in evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And we have decaying infrastructure. It's decaying communications infrastructure, decaying physical infrastructure, decaying urban infrastructure. I think the school debate that we have is a little bit more complicated because we certainly don't lack for spending money on education.
Yeah.
We probably aren't spending money well on the kinds of education we need. We poo-poo vocational education. We celebrate humanities education. And, I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't celebrate humanities education, but we ought to probably have a little more rigorous embracing of good vocational education or good specific training,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, this is obviously an immense discussion, but the point is, the issue is not that we're spending a lot. It's kind of what are we spending on in the short term.
And what are the wasteful things we're spending it on now?
Well, look, I mean, anything that is present, immediate, and consumption-oriented is always potentially wasteful. I mean, it doesn't mean it's some of it's necessary, right? We need to eat, we need to travel, or we need to get from point A to point B. That's all consumption. But things like tax breaks, and this is where I just don't agree with the Republican mantra, unless those tax breaks go into investment, they're essentially consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's breaking the rate or sending people $300 checks.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily lead to anything in the future.
Right.
And frankly, savings is not in and of itself overly productive. So, I think there too you have some real issues.
Well, as far as the relative infrastructure of America and China, I'll tell you, when I flew from Beijing Airport to JFK, I felt like I'd come from a modern
Third
nation
world
to
country
a
to a first world
developing
country.
nation.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an absolute... Because
I went right into the New York City transit system. I went on the Long Island Railroad to the New York subway. It was like, this is not progress coming from the Beijing airport to this. Well,
it's hard to get away from that viscerally.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the Beijing airport is not representative of China, but I'll tell you, you can leave Beijing and go to a city like Xi'an or something and be blown away by some of the infrastructure they've developed.
Right. And Brazil is beginning to do the same thing. I mean, Brazil is more comparable to us in kind of a messy democracy, right?
Uh-huh.
And yet they, too, are able to do things like a much more cohesive national energy policy, a much more cohesive national grid policy, a much more cohesive sustainability policy. I mean, it's almost like some resource nations seem to fall into two categories. They're either like Russia, where there's basically no economic planning, and they actually don't even reinvest in their own resource production. They just sort of use the income as much as they can. But then there are resource nations like Brazil, which kind of get the fact that maybe they won't have these resources forever, and they better take the income that they have right now and build things like renewable energy resources and transportation that's not car dependent and infrastructure that is efficient and energy efficient.
So you don't buy the old joke, Brazil is the country of the future and it always will be.
Well, I do buy the old joke. I just don't buy it as a new joke. Okay. It's a great joke. It's probably more true of Argentina than it is of Brazil.
So, this has been great. I'm holding up a couple of your books, but you also have the one is about China. Superfusion is about China. But your newest book is not in my possession yet. But it's about like if I were running a large business or something, it would be the kind of book I would buy to straighten myself out, as I recall correctly.
Yeah, I mean it's about businesses and sustainability. It's sort of the business implications of what I just talked about, that national policy.
And what's the name of it?
It's called Sustainable Excellence: The Future of Business in a Fast-Changing World.
Well, I'm in favor of that. Maybe I should get it. I seek sustainable excellence myself.
Yes, well, we all do, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of about how do you be excellent in a sustainable fashion, and how do you sustain your excellence.
I'm so in favor of that.
There you go.
I'm going to run out now. In fact, I'm just going to get the Kindle version. I can't wait.
Just run out now.
I can't wait to run out. So, so thank you. And people, all they have to do to see you is plug into some medium, you know?
Yeah, or you can go to my website, which is www.rivertwice.com.
Now, is that a reference to you can never step in the same river twice?
It's definitely a reference to you can never step in the same river twice, and the idea simply being that life is about change and that the only real constancy is change. So, a whole other discussion, but I'm a firm believer in this time it's different. This time it's always different. We just don't always know how it's different.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's Buddhist enough to appeal to me.
Good.
So thank you, Zachary, and I hope you'll, in between your many appearances on better-known media, show up on Blogging Heads again sometime.
Well, this was the first time, and hopefully it will not be the best time.
Hopefully it will not be... Wait, what does that mean? Hopefully...
Well, it's an inversion of the old, it's never the best time. It's never the best the first time.
It's never the best the first time. Okay. Okay. But it was good, right? You're feeling good, right?
It seemed fine.
It seemed fine. Your serotonin level is reasonably high, right?
From what I can tell.
Okay, well, let's leave it there.
I'm going to check once I get off the link.
Let's leave it there, and we'll see if our commenters can't say something to lower it, and then move on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Zachary. See you around.